All right, guys, welcome to another Creator of the Week video. And in this video, we're going to learn about Sqlx. Now, before we get started, just remember that I do have some Udemy courses for Rust and TypeScript, especially this one right here, which will go into further depth of Sqlx, as well as teaching you how to build an Actix web server. All right, so let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we need to do is set up our environment because our Sqlx examples will be running off of a Postgres database. So I've set up the Docker file, and then this deployment script is going to set everything up as well as do the migration at the end. So just to be clear, I'm talking about this table creation in our Postgres database. So then what you need to do is deploy the script, and at the very end you should see the migration is run, which again sets up our database and sets up our one table right here. So to go over the schema of this table, we have an integer primary key. We have a couple of timestamps that will be defaulted, so we don't need to actually insert the value ourselves. And then the username, the full name, and the email. Okay, so then the first thing that we need to do is we need to get a connection to our database. So I'm going to use a connection pool. And this requires the max number of connections. And then in this case, as you can see, I've already set up the path. And by the way, these values are in the environment right here in the Docker file. So then after I await it, because everything is asynchronous in Sqlx, I unwrap it and then I get the actual connection pool. Okay, so then the first example querying type that we're going to show is an insert. And I want to do that because we need to have some data in the system in order to start querying it. But before I actually start writing the code, just to be clear, there are actually three different types of querying inside of Sqlx. So there's a type of querying that uses Sqlx's built-in types that are kind of generic. So they're sort of like the table, the row, the column in a generic sort of a way. And then there's another type that is quite sophisticated that works off of macros. And what it will do is live when you are actually developing your code, it will go to the database and read the schema and get the types that way. So for me personally, I don't like either of the two options. So what we're going to use is the statically typed option, where we get to create the mapping types, meaning the Rust types that map to the schema in the database itself, and I'll show you that in just a moment. And I just prefer that type because it gives more control over how to work the system. So let's take a look at that now. So we need our connection once again in order to do our query. So the username, full name, and then the string. So this represents a new user because again, those timestamps are just auto inserted. Now, in order to get something back, because in this case, we are doing an insert, so we'd probably like to see that ID, that new ID that we created. So I'm going to create this type that will represent the static type for that ID. But if this query should fail, let's just move this. if this query should fail, we need to get a Sqlx error type because it contains all the variations of different types of database failures that could happen. So then this is our statically typed querying syntax. So the first generic type we need to set up is the fact that we are using Postgres as the backend, right? If we were using MySQL or whatever, then we would have to indicate that as well. Although, since we're not going to actually use it, we don't really need to care about it. So I'm going to blank it out. So before we start the actual query, let's define this. So it's a struct, and any entity ID that is of an integer type, we just set it up as an I64. It has to be an I64 for Sqlx to recognize it. And additionally, it has to be serializable, and it has to define the from row so that Sqlx knows that we are trying to map between our database and our type. All right, so we do insert into profile. Let me just get rid of all of this, the squigglies. This is only temporary. So we need to pass parameters, and the way you do that is with the $sign. And these are numbered in the order in which we bind them. So this would be number 1, this would be number 2, and so on. And then again, we are returning the new ID. So we can do that with Postgres. And then finally, in Sqlx, we have to tell Sqlx what type of query or fetching that we are trying to do. So in this case, we want a single item to come back. So then we would use this call right here. And we need, again, that connection. So we pass that in, and we just await on it. Now I can get rid of this. And so we have our insert function that is returning an entity ID. So we come back to main. So we'll just use my name. As you can see, we have entity ID. So let's print that out. So you can see right here, result is 1. Okay, so if we want to insert a new record, we probably later on will want to query for it. So let's do that right now. So I just want to query by the ID, the entity ID. Now, again, before we returned a single ID record, so we used entity ID, this time we want to return the entire entity that represents a profile. So let's build that out. And by the way, all the types that are needed are already in the cargo.toml. And yes, we need Chronos because those are the proper mappings, just like I64 to a date time. And then we had the email. And again, from row. And this time I want to display everything inside of the profile. So we'll derive from debug. And because an invalid ID might be sent, we should make this an optional. And again, it might fail. So just like before, we ignore the database type because we're not using it. And the type being returned. So this is easy, so I'll just not bother with that stuff. So give me an entity from the profile where the ID is equal to the first parameter. So again, we need to choose what kind of query we're trying to do, right? So we want to do an optional query because the ID might be invalid, it doesn't exist, but at the same time, we don't want it to fail outright because it's not really a failure, right? So we just make it optional. And then we await on it. And so this should work. So we saw before it had a value of 1. So this time I'm going to double unwrap since it is an optional, and that should give us the profile. And again, I want everything. So let's run that. So you can see we have with my name, full name, the email. All right. So if I want to insert, if I want to query, I probably also want to update. And in this case, just for testing, Let's just update one single field. Now, normally I would return something like this because I know if it didn't fail, then it's fine, right? But just for demonstration purposes, I'm going to return the actual type coming from Sqlx itself. Now this time we have to do the query differently and use just the query function itself because we don't really care about the data coming back, nor are we trying to map it to anything, right? Now we still need to indicate the database type that we're hitting, but again, we don't care because we know it's Postgres. So I'm doing underscore. I did forget to add the ID because we don't want to update everybody's username. So the first is the username, the second is the ID, and this time we are just executing because we're not fetching anything, we're not getting anything back. So again, normally I would return nothing, but let's see what's in here. So again, we had an ID of 1. So we'll see what's in here. So it doesn't give us any data back, but it does give us the number of affected rows. And again, because I did pass the ID, we knew it only affects one row, but if I didn't, then if we had a ton of data in there, it would indicate how many records were affected. All right. So then finally, we probably want to delete. So let's do that. And again, we only need an ID. Again, let's just see the number of affected rows. Again, we're not getting anything back. So we want to delete a single record from the profile with an ID of the one given. And again, we don't care about mapping anything. So that looks good. Let's come back here. So this time, let's add the query back to confirm that the deletion was successful. So then here, we should see the PG result, but we're not really going to look at that. But here, we should see an optional come back if this was successful. So as you can see, none came back because we had deleted the record initially, and then we searched for the same record. Yeah, so that was a fast overview of Sqlx. If you liked the video, please like, subscribe. Again, I have a more in-depth video in my Udemy, both of Sqlx and Actix web server. Thanks for watching.